Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on today's Solo Flight Special Edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. This is the final boarding call, and I cordially invite you to claim your seats, fasten your seat belts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, because there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, in case you haven't noticed, President Barack Hussein Obama held a sham of a town hall meeting for his unconstitutional proposed gun confiscation executive orders, which was held at George Mason University, in which I believe is located in Fairfax, Virginia, and was hosted by the Communist News Network. Now, this was interesting because it was supposed to outline everything that he was saying, and it was given off as some sort of perception, or to have the perception of showing that he really didn't want to confiscate decent, law-abiding American citizens' firearms. But what it didn't go to show is something that was discovered in one of the letters or emails that had been sent out to students by George Mason University, stating that tickets would not be available to the event because it was an invitation-only event. So that immediately raises some significant questions. In other words, the university and this Obama regime were absolutely controlling the message. So instead of being a true dialogue, it was being shaped by the administration to try and score some political points. Now, it is interesting to note that they did have one concession within this supposed town hall sham, which was the appearance of Taya Kyle, the wife of the late American sniper Chris Kyle, who is perhaps one of the best-known American servicemen who served in the role of sniper, and who himself was a victim of a former service member suffering from some sort of mental illness, and who turned the gun on Kyle at a gun range, which is one of those horrific and tragic events. But I do have to applaud Mrs. Kyle for standing up for Americans' gun rights, for that fundamental and unalienable right that we have all been endowed with by our Creator to defend our other fundamental and unalienable rights. As Jeremy and I have oft-times reiterated on past episodes of the Wright Flyer, the fundamental and unalienable right of the people to keep and bear firearms is one of the most, if not the most, important rights enjoyed and exercised by the American citizenry, because it is the vital one that is utilized to defend all of our other fundamental and unalienable rights. And when you look at the Second Amendment, the way that the extremist left-wingers, those utopian socialists who truly do want to confiscate all firearms in this country, point to, they try and pick apart the language of the Second Amendment to say that it is outdated, that it only points to militias because of that first clause. But what that first clause is really designed to do is to explain a particular reason as to why we have the right, but not the sole reason as to why we have the right. And that is exceedingly important. And the reason that I say that is because Obama does, during this town hall meeting, attempt to play down this line of people from southern Illinois, which is very close to Kentucky, are all avid hunters, as if the Second Amendment only speaks to hunting. Because the reason that that is so important is that it's an attempt by the regime to limit the ability of the people to keep and bear firearms. And that is an undeniable reality. And I also will get into a little bit about how Obama was very irked that people like Jeremy and yours truly are sitting here saying that the president is trying to confiscate firearms. He will go in and say that that is a conspiracy. But the fact of the matter is, he keeps pointing to Australia as justification. And not just Australia, he's also even pointed to Red China as an example of why gun confiscation would be good and how gun confiscation could work. Of course, he really shouldn't point to foreign nations because, as Article 6, Clause 2 of our shared Constitution clearly states in no uncertain terms, the United States Constitution itself is the supreme law of the land. And try as he may, the language of the Second Amendment is quite clear when it says the right of the people to keep and bear firearms shall not be infringed. But you see, this is what they're getting to try and play this little game of semantics, to dance around it. And that's always what the left does. They always play into these games of semantics. So what he's trying to do is to say that I'm not trying to confiscate your guns, but I am trying to infringe upon your fundamental and unalienable rights. And how, pray tell, is he trying to do that? Well, he wants to, first of all, ban so-called assault weapons, and as I've said on previous episodes of the Wright Flyer, that is a term I really loathe and despise because it is both vague and ambiguous. It allows the government to have near carte blanche power to claim that any kind of firearm could be classified as an assault weapon. Now, of course, they're going to attempt to downplay that and say that I'm one of those conspiracists that is just nuts. But really, there is truth to it, because everything about what Obama wants, say, for example, the proposed universal background checks, that now creates a national registry. And every time that there has ever been a national registry with respect to firearms, it has been a precursor to complete and total confiscation. Look at Nazi Germany, look at the Bolshevik movement in Russia, look at any of the tin pot dictators that have used this. And then even in the so-called more benign socialist regimes, England, it was a step-by-step process. They just kept increasing the taxes on the firearms, on the ammunition, and then all of the regulations as to where you could keep them, or where you could have them, what types you could have, until ultimately they just made it to where they confiscated. And the same thing happened in Australia after there was a shooting in 1996. Now, it's interesting that the president probably won't do anything to admit that the violent crime rates in England and Australia skyrocketed after they implemented gun confiscation. And can you blame American gun owners for feeling nervous when they see the president keep pointing to all of these drastic, austere type of firearm regulations that are truly draconian and are absolutely violative of the clear and concise language of the Second Amendment? But moreover, it's also violative of the Privileges and Immunities Clause, because when you stop and think about it, the rights of the people should not ever be infringed. The government should never position itself in a way as to deprive the citizens of their fundamental and unalienable rights. And the only way that you can do that is, well, the only two ways that you can do that really is, one, if somebody has violated someone else's rights, if you go through true due process and adjudicate that the person has committed a crime, then okay, that at that point, that is a true part of our criminal justice system as it was originally intended and designed by our founding fathers, with the various court systems of the several states, and that's keeping in line with the tenets of federalism, which, after all, is devised under and inspired by the natural law tenets that underpin our entire representative Republican form of government. And truly, that is also how a federalist government would work, where the states would be able to implement that just as long as they are not violating the clear and concise terms of the United States Constitution itself, which absolutely is the supreme law of the land. But with gun confiscation, we see here that he's trying to, once again, federalize everything, but in such a way as to go against the Constitution. And the other way that I mentioned, the only other way that you could get rid of this fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms would be to amend the United States Constitution. And there is historical precedent for that. You only have to look back to the Volstead Act of 1919, which pushed through the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibited the sale of alcohol and the manufacture of alcohol, and that was overturned by the 21st Amendment. So if Obama really wants to implement these things, he should go abide by what the Constitution says in Article 5, which actually does put strict limitations on the amendment process. And the reason for that is these are fundamental and unalienable rights. There really must be a concrete reason to attempt to amend the Constitution. And the Founding Fathers had designed it that way to ensure that things like Obama's gun confiscation plan just couldn't come to fruition easily, because that is the tendency of governments, no matter where they are, and no matter what point in history you are in, they always tend to march towards greater control and oppression. And the reason being is that they exist to assume more power for themselves. And it is the natural state of government to move progressively towards corruption. And, you know, folks, speaking of semantics, perhaps this is the very reason why the progressive movement refers to itself as progressives, because they want to progressively push the United States ever closer to a corrupt, centralized government that is top-heavy and a command and control type of government where all edicts come from the top and the people must just bow down and accept whatever edicts that they hand down. Now, I want to get back to this idea that CNN and along with George Mason University and the president himself were trying to paint this so-called town hall thing as an open discussion, yet it was by invitation only. So in other words, there's no way to really tell what the cross-section of the local community in that area has to say, and it shows that I have no doubt that most of the questions there were handpicked, and it would allow Obama to appear as though he is above the fray, and thereby allowing him to sort of hide his true intentions and purposes with respect to this meeting, and not just the meeting, but also his proposed extra-constitutional executive orders to infringe upon the fundamental and unalienable right of the American people to keep and bear firearms. And, you know, one of the things that I found completely disingenuous about the president during this meeting was how he kept saying that he really did respect the Second Amendment. But if you really respected the Second Amendment, you'd go by the clear and concise language of it that says the right of the people to keep and bear firearms shall not be infringed. That means no magazine bans or, high-capacity magazine bans. It means no assault weapons bans. It means no limitations, because the language says the right of the people to keep and bear firearms shall not be infringed, period. Nevertheless, I did think it was kind of interesting that Anderson Cooper and President Obama kind of got into a spat over what the president was doing and how people perceived him, particularly what they were trying to paint as right-wing zealots with respect to claiming that he would just keep taking more and more and more until he moved towards absolute and total confiscation of American citizens' firearms. And I've actually got the clip here.
A conspiracy? I mean, there's a lot of people really believe this deeply, that they just don't they just don't trust you.
I'm sorry, Cooper. Yes, it is fair to call it a conspiracy. What are you saying?
Well, I can't speak for Mr. Cooper, Mr. President, but I can speak for myself, And for Jeremy and for our first Air Marshal, Mr. Nelson Ward, when I say it's absolutely a conspiracy by government to move against the fundamental and unalienable right of the people to keep and bear firearms, you have made that your goal ever since you first assumed the reins of political power back in January of 2009. And now you're being totally disingenuous about it. But go on, Mr. President, continue to spin your tale of deceit.
Are you suggesting that the notion that we are creating a plot to take everybody's guns away so that we can impose martial law
but there's certainly
is
a lot of
a
people.
Conspiracy? Yes, that is a conspiracy. I would hope.
Well, why would you say that that's a conspiracy, Mr. President? Because you keep pointing to Red China. They confiscated firearms and imposed martial law. You point to Australia. They confiscated firearms. Is that a conspiracy that you have pointed to them as an example for the type of so-called common sense gun regulations that you want to adopt here in the United States? Pardon me, sir, but you don't have a track record of telling the truth. As I recall, with respect to Obamacare, when you were trying to peddle that to the American people, and what a disaster of a bill that is, you said, quote, "If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, period," close quote. And, quote, "If you like your health insurance plan, you can keep your health insurance plan, period," close quote. I'm sorry, that actually wound up to be not true. So, forgive me, Mr. President, but your track record speaks volumes, and I do adhere by the old adage that actions speak louder than words, and your actions have spoken voluminous messages about who you are and what you believe and how you work. So, I'm sorry, you just don't have any credibility at this point, Mr. President.
Except on some websites around the country?
There are certainly a lot of people who just have a fundamental distrust that you do not want to go further and further and further down this road.
Look, I mean, I'm only going to be here for another year.
So what, Mr. President? So what? That is a totally irrelevant point. The fact that you're only going to be there for a year has nothing to do with the fact that you are laying the groundwork for stripping decent, law-abiding, red-blooded American citizens of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. You know, the whole idea and definition of unalienable is that you can't encroach upon it, you can't step upon it, you can't belittle it, but that's exactly what you're doing here. So you can do your little I type thing and try and dance around the issue, but the fact of the matter remains that you truly are attempting to infringe upon the fundamental and unalienable right of the American people, which is safeguarded and codified in the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And folks, stop and think about this for a moment. Imagine if we applied this same type of logic to every other right that is contained within the Bill of Rights. Let's take the First Amendment. Oh, well, that's outdated. You know, they didn't realize that computers would be around, and therefore we should just allow the government to pry into computers because they also never envisioned terrorism. You know, it's not far-fetched to believe that that would be the case. We see dubious Marxist Rubio pushing for unfettered NSA snooping into the American people's computers without a warrant. Again, perhaps the Fourth Amendment being outdated. But then you also have El Jefe Jeb Bush claiming that nobody's civil liberties have been violated. Maybe he should go back and read the Fourth Amendment, because it pretty much says that the right of the people to be safe against unreasonable searches and seizures, particularly in their homes, persons, papers, and effects, that requires a warrant supported by probable cause, either by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the person or place or things to be searched and or seized. But maybe that's just outdated. Maybe a Gestapo-style system's better. But You see, that's always the way it is with these detente members of the gutless opposition party, and particularly with the Democratic Socialist Party and this regime. They always try and hoodwink the American people. They want to lull you into a false sense of security. Oh no, we're not really out to grab your guns or to invade your privacy or to infringe upon your fundamental and unalienable rights. Oh, that's just a bunch of whack jobs on the internet saying that. Once again, Mr. President, your actions speak far louder than your words do. Forgive me, but your track record is less than stellar on this issue.
But when would I have started on this enterprise, right?
You started on it when you first assumed the reins of political power. You've been pushing for this ever since your first term. So, I believe that's when it started, Mr. President. And let's not forget Operation Fast and Furious and Operation Gunrunner. You know, those things have been pretty bad. And then you sit there and want to force just some casual gun dealers that anyone who sells about 5 firearms at a given time to be licensed. Here's a question. Do you have to be federally licensed to be a federal agency that is just peddling guns to drug cartels in Mexico? I have a feeling you don't. And are we ever going to get down to holding the members of that governmental agency accountable for the death of that Border Patrol agent who was just trying to do his job and keep this country safe? Come on, Mr. President. Please don't play these stupid games with us, because your shtick, it's threadbare. We see right through it. We know exactly who you are. We know what your agenda is, and we're just sick and tired of it.
I come from the state of Illinois, which we've been talking about Chicago, but downstate Illinois is closer to Kentucky than it is to Chicago.
Notice the way that he condescendingly attempts to adopt a southern accent when he speaks about Kentucky. Your contempt knows no bounds, does it, Mr. President? No, I know the answer to that rhetorical question, but please do continue with your deceptive lies.
And everybody hunts down there. And a lot of folks own guns. And so this is not like alien territory to me.
Okay, Mr. President, if it's not alien territory to you, then you wouldn't be for high-capacity magazine bans or assault weapons bans, which really don't do anything because it's just going after the aesthetic aspects of the gun, as Jeremy and I have pointed out on past episodes of The Wright Flyer. Or is it just that you're being intellectually disingenuous again? I'm going to go with the latter more so than the former, because there is a clear pattern of conduct on your part, and we know exactly what it is that you're trying to do, because it's been done before, and it didn't work before, and it damn well isn't going to work now. But please, continue, Mr. President.
It's a false notion that I believe is circulated for either political reasons or commercial reasons in order to prevent a coming together among people of goodwill to develop common sense rules that will make us safer while preserving the Second Amendment.
Wait. Now who's talking about a conspiracy? Oh, so you think that people that are concerned about protecting their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms are now plotting against you to prevent you from keeping people safe? Do you realize how ridiculous you sound, Mr. President? But that's okay. This is typical, straight out of Joseph Goebbels' principles of propaganda. You're attempting to personify an entire group, to shift the blame, to project your own twisted machinations onto the real decent red-blooded American citizens who are concerned and are attempting to protect and preserve their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms as codified in the Second Amendment. Forgive me, but your hypocrisy knows no limits, Mr. President.
And the notion that we can't agree on some things while not agreeing on others. And the reason for that is because, well, the president secretly wants to do X.
Secretly? No, Mr. President, you've made no secret about your contempt for the gun-owning American citizens. I tend to recall that during the first campaign season for you, when you were trying to run for your first term of office, you described conservatives as those bitter people who cling to their guns and Bibles. There's nothing secret about the contempt and venom that you hold for decent, law-abiding American citizens. You've already stated that you want us to follow a model like Red China or Australia or England, where there has been nothing but gun confiscation. Oh, you also point to Canada. Well, boy, they too had gun confiscation. So spare me, Mr. President. There's nothing covert about your intent. It's all overt. You just think we're too stupid to catch on.
It would mean that we'd be paralyzed about doing everything. I mean, maybe when I propose to make sure that unsafe drugs are taken off the market, that secretly I'm trying to control the entire drug industry or take people's drugs away, but probably not. What's more likely is I just want to make sure that people are not dying by taking bad drugs.
Oh, you mean like how you weren't going to try and take away people's health insurance or to take away their doctors from them through Obamacare? That if you liked your health plan, you could keep your health plan, period? Or that if you liked your doctor, you could keep your doctor, period? Once again, Mr. President, your pattern of conduct, your past pattern of behavior is well established. Nobody is buying into your malarkey other than those utopian socialists who goose-step behind you already. You know, what you're doing is following in the footsteps of Adolf Hitler. I sure hope you're proud of yourself, Mr. President, because that is not somebody that I would want to emulate or someone whose policies I would like to implement. But then again, you always go down this path of utopian socialism. You've done that since your youth because of who you were influenced by. Frank Marshall Davis Jr. comes to mind, Mr. President, but by all means, you have, once again, orchestrated a dog and pony show, the type of propagandistic kangaroo court system that the Nazis were famous for, saying that you care about the people and that what you're doing is for the people. Meanwhile, you're going to push for these redistributive schemes and you're going to attempt to encroach upon and infringe upon the fundamental and unalienable rights of the American people. That is your pattern of conduct. It has been what you've done since you assumed the reins of political power back in January of 2009. And don't play like we don't know. We've seen your actions. We have lived through your regime, and it has been disastrous. There is no other way to describe it than an unmitigated and unwarranted disaster. You have plunged this country closer and closer to the edge and precipice of destruction as you push us to one constitutional crisis after another. You are not a leader, Mr. President. You are what did you call yourself? A community organizer, moving around in a thug-like fashion, attempting to hold the fundamental and unalienable rights of the American people hostage, and we are sick and tired of it. Folks, again, this is why Jeremy and I say that it is so vital for you to have a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared Constitution and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights, because there can be no question that these potentates, these wannabe dictators, will do everything in their power to try and pull the wool over your eyes. But you can't just take their words at face value, because it's quite clear that the president does not have a good track record with truthfulness. And you can look this up yourself. You can see it in other news articles that are out on the web. You can see it by those who understand what he's pushing for, and the truth is out there. But you're not going to get it from the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media, because they are once again going to do what they have done ever since this president first assumed office, and that is carry water for him and act as a pillar of his regime to push forward his agenda come hell or high water. That is what we are seeing in this country, and that is what the president is actually attempting to do. But, it doesn't just stop there. I'm sure you all recall that on a past episode of the Wright Flyer, when we were first talking about President Obama's extra-constitutional executive order to push for the infringement of our Second Amendment rights, that I mentioned that he had met with Gabby Giffords. Remember, the Arizona congresswoman who liked to pretend that she was pro-gun and then would shoot at paper targets depicting children? Yeah, that Gabby Giffords. She met with him, and they were going to push for their plans again. And so, all of a sudden, they too were a part of this dog and pony show. I just wanted to see the communist flag unfurled as the Soviet national anthem played in the background, because this had all of the pomp and circumstance of some Pravda production at the height of communism. It's really disgusting, but that is what we saw. And so now, let's actually hear what Mark Kelly, the astronaut and AR-15 straw purchaser, had to say with respect to universal background checks.
Often what you hear in the debate of expanding background checks to more gun sales, and as you know, Gabby and I are 100% behind the concept of somebody getting a background check before buying a gun. But when we testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, we heard not only from the gun lobby, but from United States senators that expanding background checks will, not may, will lead to a registry, which will lead to confiscation, which will lead to a tyrannical government. I would like you to explain, with 350 million guns in 65 million places, households, from Key West to Alaska, 350 million objects in 65 million places. If the federal government wanted to confiscate those objects, how would they do that?
What I think Mark is alluding to is what I said earlier, this notion of a conspiracy out there, and it gets wrapped up in concerns about the federal government. Now, there's a long history of that. That's in our DNA. The United States was born suspicious of some distant authority.
So, Mark Kelly is sitting there trying to say that, well, how would you confiscate guns? It can't be possible. Just look at all those numbers. I mean, it's just like, I support universal background checks. That's why I broke the law and did straw purchases to prove the point that it was possible. And, disingenuous people like Mark Kelly get under my skin, because what they do is they break the law, and then they're not held accountable for it because they're trying to push forward the propagandistic message of this tyrannical regime. And then to say that it is a conspiracy is a bunch of malarkey. How do they do it? They do it incrementally. They do it by first having a registry. Then they say that a certain type of firearm is not allowed. Then what they do is they go and tax these things until they're out of existence, or they outlaw the certain types of firearms, and then they run a background check on you to see whether you own one of those because it's in the registry. Then they go house by house to those who haven't participated in the buyback program and seize the firearms. That's how they do it, Mr. Kelly. You know, Russia did it, and Russia had a very large population of gun owners even. But that didn't stop the Bolsheviks. But, okay, Mark, we'll buy into it. And then as for you, Mr. President, to claim that these gun rights advocates are speaking of a conspiracy. You're the one that is speaking of the conspiracy, saying that we've formed this cabal to stop keeping the people safe. No, we understand what it would take to keep the people safe. The real answer to keeping Americans safe is to allow more people to keep and bear firearms. It is to encourage people to exercise their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. An armed society is a polite society. You know, it just goes to show that the narrative that is always spoken about with respect to these gun grabbers is the same. They look upon us with contempt, and they seem to think that we are a bunch of morons who just don't understand the way the world works. However, we do understand the way the world works. We have seen other governments confiscate the firearms of law-abiding citizens. And yeah, you're not doing it in one fell swoop, because that won't work. So you're going to go by the Fabian socialist method of incrementally moving to encroach upon and abridge the rights of decent, law-abiding American citizens. Again, it speaks to how you don't believe America is exceptional, Mr. President. And as for the criminal Mark Kelly, He shouldn't have even been on that stage. He shouldn't have had a say after he broke the law. So, once again, Mr. President, in your dog and pony show, your hypocrisy knows no limits, because what you were absolutely doing in that case is showing that I, the President of the United States of America, am selectively enforcing the law. You are once again destroying that notion that the United States of America is a nation of laws, not of men. You are destroying the idea of equal protection and application of the law. That is totally contrary to our representative Republican form of government. It's absolutely against the natural law tenets that underpin our government, and it's certainly against the vision that our founding fathers had when they devised this country over 2 centuries ago. Mr. President, please stop in your disingenuous games. Just admit that you are a wannabe tyrant that wants to strip and deprive the decent, law-abiding, red-blooded American citizens of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. That's the only thing that you are concerned about here. It's not about safety. If it were about safety, you wouldn't be proposing things that wouldn't stop any of the mass shootings. If you were really concerned about safety, you would be out there demanding that we do away with any and all so-called gun-free zones. It's because when you implement these twisted, radical, extremist left-wing ideologies and principles that you really make the people less safe. That is when you expose the American people to grave danger. It's not when people exercise their fundamental and unalienable rights. You know, criminals don't register their guns, Mr. Obama. They never have, they never will. And it doesn't matter how many laws you make, what's one more law for them to break? They don't care. They already don't have a respect for the legal system. So the only ones that you're punishing are the decent, law-abiding American citizens. The only ones that you are making more safe, are the criminals. You're making them more brazen because they can go out of the woodwork and feel completely at home and safe to have carte blanche with the law-abiding American citizens. Why would you do that? Well, the answer is simple. You think that only the government should have power. And you are diametrically opposed to the idea that ultimate sovereignty rests in the hands of we the people. That is diametrically opposed to everything that this country stands for and represents. That is diametrically opposed to everything that has made this country great. America is great because her people are free. And her people are free because they are the beneficiaries of the greatest birthright of any people on the face of the planet. And that is our shared United States Constitution. But at every given opportunity, you take every step you can to tear that document apart, and you spit in the face of countless American citizens, servicemen and women, all of those who have died in the line of duty to protect us and to uphold our rights. You belittle those who serve, and you violate your oath of office, both as an attorney, but you've already given up your law license, so that doesn't apply anymore, but your oath as the President of the United States. You have sworn to uphold and defend the United States Constitution from enemies both foreign and domestic, yet you have become the greatest threat to the Constitution in this current generation. And that's not something that we can just turn a blind eye to, Mr. President. It has been a continuous pattern with you, an undeniable pattern, and you are just doubling down on it. Well, that's not the way that this country is meant to operate, and that is not acting in the best interests of the American people. But you've never had the best interests of the American people at heart or in mind. You've just wanted to push forward with this radical, extremist, left-wing, utopian socialist agenda that you are so incapable of divorcing yourself from. And what you're doing is pushing forward that whole idea of yours to fundamentally transform the country. Well, Mr. President, you don't fundamentally transform something you love, and you don't fundamentally transform something that works. You know, it brings up another old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Ah, but you say it's broke. You say it's broken, don't you, Mr. President? You attempt to sit there and say that, look, gun violence is so bad, yet violent crime is at an all-time low. And it's not due to firearms owners. Now, yes, there are sociopaths, but you're never going to be able to stop the sociopath from wreaking havoc and carnage, and you're certainly never going to stop them from getting their weapon of choice. And if you disarm the American people, what you are truly doing is you are depriving them of the best method in which to utilize to protect themselves, not only from said sociopaths, but from any type of tyrannical government that would try and move upon the American citizens to deprive them of their life, liberty, and their ability to have the pursuit of happiness. Let's face it, Mr. President, that is the reality that we are facing in this country right now. That is the first step of what this program is reaching to achieve. And you can try and deny it all you like, just like you tried to deny that your Obama healthcare reform, your Obamacare plan there, wouldn't deprive people of their health insurance plans. It did me. It did countless people I know. And it took away their doctors, too. Come on, Mr. Obama. Enough is enough with your lies, your deceit, and your attempts to deceive the American people while stabbing them in the back. You are not acting with respect to the American people, and you are not acting within the purview of your constitutional authority. You are spitting upon the American people, you are attempting to legislate from the executive branch, which is impermissible, and you are attempting to fundamentally transform this country in a negative way. Meanwhile, we hear that there are so-called refugees that have been arrested in California from Iraq and Syria who have terror connections with ISIS and other terror groups. Yet You haven't said word one about that. You don't even want to call it Islamo-fascist terrorism. You're afraid to do that because it goes against your agenda. So you see, when terrorism is on the rise, instead of encouraging the American people to do what they are obliged to do with their fundamental and unalienable rights and the duties and obligations that attach therewith, you attempt to disarm them, exposing them to even greater danger to those terrorists. I'm reminded of the Paris attacks. Paris has strict gun laws, yet the terrorists were able to carry out their heinous and dastardly attacks, and it was exacerbated by the fact that nobody could really stand up to them because the French citizens are disarmed. That is the type of danger that you are trying to push forward here in the United States. And it has no place in a free and open society like the United States, Mr. President. That's not a conspiracy. You yourself have pointed to these gun-free, quote-unquote, societies as the example. But, Mr. President, those other cultures do not have our shared United States Constitution. And please spare me your intellectually disingenuous line that you do care about the Second Amendment and that we can have so-called common sense gun control regulations or common sense gun regulations that are in line with the Constitution. The only common sense gun regulation that's out there is the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Its language is unwavering, it is very clear and concise, and it says that the right of the people to keep and bear firearms shall not be infringed, period. And unlike you, Mr. President, when you say things like, well, if you like your doctor, you can keep them, period, or if you like your healthcare plan, you can keep it, period, their period actually means the end of the sentence. They didn't cross their fingers when they drafted that great document and when they ratified the Bill of Rights to the United States Constitution in December of 1791. Oh, and don't get me started on your little no-flight list thing either, Mr. President, because, you know, the fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms is a constitutional right. You have to have due process to deprive that. In other words, there has to be a notice and a hearing, and they have to have a chance to face their accuser and to rebut it. Well, there is no due process with getting placed on the no-flight list. And I'm really kind of surprised, in a rhetorical sense, that you would push for something like that, because if I recall right, one of the acolytes and bastions and stalwarts of your radical and extremist left-wing ideology, Ted Kennedy, had erroneously been placed on the no-flight list. You know, maybe he thought it would be better to just swim somewhere because he was a good swimmer, apparently. But no, Mr. President, what you are attempting to do is violative of the spirit, the letter, and the actual application of the law, and it has no place in a free society like the United States. And it is quite clear, very clear, that you hold those of us that want to preserve and ensure that our liberties are safeguarded in the utmost contempt. And you don't even have to take my words for it, folks, because Taya Kyle stood up to you, and I've got that clip here, folks, for you.
We're at an all-time low for a murder rate. That's a big deal. And yet I think most of us in this country feel like it could happen at any moment. It could happen to any of us at any time. And I'm almost finished. Just when you talk about the NRA and after a mass shooting that gun sales go up, I would argue that it's not necessarily that I think somebody's going to come take my gun from me, but I want the hope, and the hope that I have the right to protect myself. That I don't end up to be one of these families. That I have the freedom to carry whatever weapon I feel I need, just like your wife said on that farm road. You know, the sheriffs aren't going to get to my house either. And I understand that background checks aren't necessarily going to stop me from getting a gun. But I also know that they wouldn't have stopped any of the people here in this room from killing. And so it seems like almost a false sense of hope. So why not celebrate where we are? I guess that's my real question is.
Well,
celebrate that we're good people, and 99.9% of us are never going to kill anyone.
Well, let me make a couple of points. First of all, thanks to your husband for his service, and thank you for your service, because extraordinary heroism that he and your family have shown in protecting all of us, and I'm very grateful for that. Number two, what you said about murder rates and violent crime generally is something that we don't celebrate enough. The fact of the matter is that violent crime has been steadily declining across America for a pretty long time. And you wouldn't always know it by watching television, but overall, most cities are much safer than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now, I challenge the notion that the reason for that is because there's more gun ownership.
Challenge it all you want, Mr. President. The facts are there. It's crystal clear. The studies have shown it. Places that have so-called lax gun control law are safer than places with the strictest gun control laws. Look at California. Their gun control laws were very strict, and yet you had San Bernardino. Look at Chicago. That city has a track record of having some of the strictest gun control measures in all of the United States of America, and yet it continues unabated. So, pardon me, Mr. President, but your challenge is duly noted and rejected because reality speaks louder than your platitudes. I'm sorry, that's just the way the world works. But let's get back to let you finish your web of deceit, Mr. President.
If you look at where are the areas with the highest gun ownership, those are the places in some cases where the crime rate hasn't dropped down that much, and the places where there's pretty stiff restrictions on gun ownership. In some of those places, the crimes dropped really quickly. So I'm not sure that there's a one-to-one correlation there.
Yeah, the reason you're not sure is that it doesn't fit your little propagandistic message. Actually, Texas and the large cities in Texas have less crime than Chicago. They have less crime than Los Angeles. They have less crime than New York City. Let's talk about these places that have the strictest gun control measures in this country. Let's talk about how gun-free zones actually make people less safe. Come on, Mr. President, stop telling lies. Stop being deceitful. It is unbecoming. But it's all you know. It's all you've ever known. It is exactly what drives you. It is what compels you to move against the fundamental and unalienable rights of the decent, law-abiding American citizens. And that is something that each and every one of us are tired of. And the reason that we're tired of it is because every time something happens, we have to look over our shoulders in absolute concern that you are going to be hovering over it in an attempt to move in an extra-constitutional fashion to strip and deprive us of our fundamental and unalienable rights at any and every given opportunity. You have done it time and time and time again, and we are simply sick of it. So, again, your pattern for the lack of truth, your pattern for attempting to attack the American people's fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms is not just going to be allowed to be swept under the rug like you're attempting to do. Social media won't allow it. Your track record is out for everyone to see, and as long as there is air in my breath, and I know for as long as there is air in the breath of my first officer Jeremy Grapenton and my first Air Marshal Nelson Ward, we will continue to harp the truth. We will continue to proclaim the truth loudly and clearly so that people are aware of just exactly what it is that you are attempting to do, to understand exactly what agenda you are trying to force upon us, because let's be, to steal a phrase from you, perfectly clear that what you're doing, Mr. President, has no place in a free, open, constitutional society like the United States of America. You know, Mr. President, The reason why our Constitution is the longest contiguous document in world history, it's because the American people have had the tools to uphold and defend it. But you're now moving to strip us of that. You're now moving to infringe upon our rights at an alarming rate. And for what? For what, Mr. President? So that you can go reach to the UN and say that we need a new order here? So that you can become a dictator? And what is the fundamental transformation of America, Mr. President? From a representative Republican form of government to a banana Republican form of government? Because that certainly seems to be what you're attempting to do, and I believe that is why Jeremy has labeled you the Chiquita-in-Chief. Because of the way that you're acting. The way that you are just marching lockstep against our fundamental and unalienable rights, and that you never, ever back off of that. That you never divorce yourself from your radical and extremist left-wing ideology and agenda. But that has no place in this society. And we will stand against it each and every time because we understand. Just as the namesake of that university where you were having that, George Mason, concluded when he was called upon to draft the Declarations of Rights for the state of Virginia and was an integral part of getting the Bill of Rights included within the United States Constitution, that the American people are endowed by their Creator with fundamental and unalienable rights that no rightful, legitimate, earthly authority may take away without due process. Except that's what you're doing. There's no due process here. This is not through the proper legislative channels as is designed and outlined in the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. This is above and beyond that. This is going to the next level. And for what? So you can feel proud of yourself? So that you can sit there and say, well, you know, I took down the United States of America, but, you know, it's not a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy that they said that I do this, and so I did it to prove that it was a conspiracy. Or something. I know what I'm saying. And thank you for your service, even though I'm going to sit there and make life miserable for our servicemen and continue to sweep the VA problems under the rug, and, you know, that's just what I do. But we can all rest assured, because Moochie is still very proud of her country for the very first time. And you know, Mr. President, you've been very disingenuous when you've been trying to say that those of us who are pointing to these well-established historical trends that have occurred in other countries, that we're just saying a conspiracy against you, that it's an imaginary fiction, that you are out to deprive us of our fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. But you yourself have said that you support a high-capacity magazine ban, that you support the assault weapons ban, and I'm sorry, Mr. President, but remember, the language of the Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear firearms shall not be infringed. So there really is no way around that. Irrespective of the way that you try to weasel out of it, irrespective of the attempts that you make to deprive decent, law-abiding American citizens of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. Again, actions speak much louder than words, but you've never cared much about the truth. I mean, after all, isn't that why you said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, and if you like your health plan, you can keep your health plan? When in fact, that was nothing but a bunch of malarkey. You weren't serious when you said that. And then your little your little minion there, Jonathan Gruber, that helped you basically design that entire disaster of a bill, was sitting there saying that was exactly your intent, to dupe the American voters. Oh, then you come out and say, well, it's a conspiracy by the right wing they're lying about me. We're not lying about you, Mr. President. You are lying to us, and we are on to your lies, and we are sick and tired of them. We absolutely are. But I know that you wanted to sit there and say that there really is no one-on-one correlation between having more people exercising their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms and a more safe population. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, let's just speak about the statistics, because the statistics that you have shown, that 30,000 American citizens have died, quote-unquote, from gun violence, never mind the fact that you're including suicides in there, car accidents, that sort of thing. 30,000 out of a country that has a population of 300 million. That is so minuscule. Mr. President, please don't play these games of semantics. Please don't lie to the American people. We really aren't stupid. I know you think we are. I know that Jonathan Gruber said that that was your policy, to say that the American people are so dumb that you just have to force this crap down our throats. But please, spare us. We are not that dumb. We really are not. And that is why the American people don't want you to move forward with this illegal, extra-constitutional attempt to strip decent, law-abiding American citizens of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. But you don't care. It's always about you, Mr. President. That's why you referred to yourself in that little 12-minute speech when you first announced your proposed gun grab over 76 times. Mr. President, why? Why do you feel a need to be so narcissistic? Why do you feel a need to try and deprive the American citizens of the best way to protect themselves, not only from these terrorists that have already struck out against us, but from a tyrannical government? Unless you really are planning something devious. And, well, it goes back to something you had said when you were first running for office, that you needed to have a private military-type force. You know, Mr. President, if you really don't believe that guns make us safer, tell the Secret Service to stop carrying their guns. Go ahead. Dispel them. You don't need them. Guns don't keep you safe. You don't need the Secret Service carrying guns. But it goes back to that old adage that we always see with the utopian socialists. It goes back to this do as I say, not as I do hypocrisy. Once again, Mr. President, spare us. It is threadbare. It is beyond agony how twisted your raw emotionalism is. Because what you're arguing is not based on fact or logic. It is not based on ration or reason. It is based on your twisted, radical, extremist, left-wing machinations. And again, I have to say that that has no place in a free and open society like the United States. And I'm sorry, Mr. President, but the law is quite clear that the right of the people to keep and bear firearms simply shall not be infringed. But you don't care. Congress already considered the ideas that you have and rejected them. Congress is the only one that is carrying the enumerated power to legislate. Mr. President, if you wanted to legislate, why didn't you do it when you were in the legislature? Instead of trying to run circles around the Constitution, instead of trying to sneak your unconstitutional gun regulations behind the back door. As Jeremy, Nelson, and I have reiterated time and time again, the only common sense gun regulation that is legal can be found within the Bill of Rights to the United States Constitution, and it is such an important right that it is the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Let me repeat that, Mr. President. The only common sense gun regulation that is legal and applicable in the United States can be found in the Bill of Rights, and it's so important that it is the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. I tell you what, Mr. President, since you seem to have a little bit of trouble with reading comprehension, let me go ahead and get my reading rainbow idea out here for you. I'll give you a remedial, special bedtime story and read you the actual language of the Second Amendment. Okay, here it comes. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There it is, Mr. President. Now, what does this mean? A well-regulated militia. That means that we, the people, in a moment of last resort, are the last resort to defending the country, that we must be able to defend the country, being necessary to the security of a free state. In other words, we are armed to protect our country from becoming a tyrannical place that would deny you the right to keep and bear firearms. Maybe. And then it goes to say the right of the people. There's your subjective clause right there, Mr. President. Isn't it amazing? The right of the people, because only people can have rights, to keep and bear arms. You know, the very thing that you're trying to limit, the very thing that you're trying to deprive, shall not be infringed. You know, it doesn't get any clearer than that, Mr. President. It literally does not get any clearer than that. The Founding Fathers spoke. Our Constitution states that we, the people, have the fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms, and that right shall not be infringed. All right, Mr. President, you want to get rid of guns? All right, you want to keep them safe? Amend the Constitution. That's what you have to do. Amend the Constitution. But you're not going to do that. No, of course not. Because that would go against your propagandistic message. And that would go against your agenda of stripping decent, law-abiding American citizens of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. We are on to you, Mr. President. And therefore, as long as you are going to continue to try and strip decent, law-abiding American citizens of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms, we so-called conspiracists will continue to tell the truth, because it is the truth that will set the people free. And as we have always said, it is the American people that are the ultimate wielders of sovereignty in this country. And with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. Ladies and gentlemen, I do invite you to leave comments here on our YouTube page or on our Facebook page or our Google Plus page. We thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. We also hope to see you the next time Jeremy and me take to the sky and leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment like we always do. Thank you for flying the Wright Flyer, ladies and gentlemen. We will see you next time. Do take care.